It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
Why is inflation so scary to the public and what's going on?
Yeah, because a lot of people, it's one of those things that you, especially for, I'm going to say young folks, and Brian, in this category, I'm going to say folks that are under the age of like 40 or 45, maybe even under the age of 50, you hear a lot academically about inflation, but frankly, we just have not seen a lot of inflation in our lifetime where we're living right now, or at least if we have, the folks who did see it were much, much younger at the time that they saw it, if they're under that age 50. So it's this theoretical thing that a lot of us lose track of it actually being like a tangible thing that's worth being scared of.
So let's go back in time to when actually inflation was scary. And probably the most recent period where we had really hyperinflation, the stuff that we're worried about, is 1973 to 1982. And look at this. This blows my mind. Inflation averaged over this decade 8.8% per year.
That's pretty substantial when you think about some of the long-term averages on inflation we'll talk about in a second. But if you talk about just specific goods, the average price of a new car over that 10-year time period went from $4,000 to almost $10,000, a little over $9,900. That was a 144% increase in the cost of a car over that decade. So if you've recently bought a car or purchased a car, I want you to think about how much you paid for it right now, and think about, man, 10 years from now to buy that same car, I'd have to spend 144% more to buy the exact same car.
Well, ask yourself, think about pickup trucks. It seems like 3 or 4 years ago, you could buy pickup trucks for, I don't know, $30,000.
Sure, yeah.
Now I see pickup trucks that are costing $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. I think about how is it going to blow all of our minds if a Honda Accord that you can currently buy for $30,000 all of a sudden was now selling for $75,000.
Hard to think about.
It's just like kaboosh. It's just that it's not just at cars though. This extends to housing and other things as well.
The average home price over this 10-year period from 1973 to 1982 went from $32,500 to $69,300. That's a 113% increase in price. So again, think about the house that you live in or the last house that you bought, fast forward 10 years and think about that same house costing you 113% more than what you paid for it, 113% more than what it's worth today. That's pretty remarkable.
And then think about consumer goods, because those are the big ticket items.
Sure.
But when we get into the household goods, inflation can cause you a lot of havoc with that as well. Let's talk about some of the basics. Milk. Look at this. It went from $1.31 a gallon to $2.24 a gallon.
That's actually a 71% increase in price over that 10-year period.
Bread went from 27 cents up to 60 cents.
That's a 122% increase in the cost of that good over that 10-year period.
And then gas went from 39 cents a gallon, which really cheap, up to $1.30.
And that's a 233% increase. So as you can see, in a relatively short amount of time, just 10 years, the price of the goods that we use every single day, the gallon of milk, the bread, the gas, the thing like that, it can get very, very expensive very, very quickly. And you can imagine if you were someone who had $1 10 years ago, and you have that same $1 now, you are recognizing it just does not go as far as it used to.
So you're worried about your purchasing power, meaning you have the dollars in your pockets, the dollar in your bank accounts, the investments you have. You're worried they're just not going to be able to keep up. Yep. That is the big fear. And then you might ask yourself, well, how bad can this actually get? Because you guys are saying the last hyperinflation was 1970, the early 70s all the way through 1982. We averaged about 8.8% per year. That sounds pretty horrible. I'm telling you guys, there's an extra gear to this thing. And we've seen this in countries that when the governments collapse is where you really see the support for the currencies fall apart. And look at this, in Venezuela, a roll of toilet paper, and I know you guys who are out there listening on the podcast, you can't see the visual, but we have a picture of a fat stack of bills right next to a stack of toilet paper. And maybe pre-pandemic, we were all feeling this a little bit with how hard it was to get toilet paper, but it still wasn't this big of a stack in 2018. And Bo, say that currency.
Yeah, so it's a bolivar, I think, is how you say that. And to buy one roll of toilet paper in Venezuela costs 2.6 million bolivars, and that is equal to roughly 40 US cents, 40 cents in US dollars. Inflation in 2018 was estimated in Venezuela to be 1 million %.
You got to hold the
Oh yeah,
pinky
the
up.
Dr. Evil. 1 million %. So that is what happens when it gets bad, when it gets scary. It can get really, really bad, and it can cause some super negative consequences when it comes to the viability of you being able to do something even as simple as go out and buy a roll of toilet paper.
So this is something we need to be prepared for. Don't let this just happen, because here's what I'm worried about with inflation is that I'm worried inflation is not going to be something that we invite just in, because I mean there's a lot of people and look, maybe I ought to save this. We'll go ahead and answer the question because I want to get into this a little deeper dive. But we've got a lot of stimulus spending going on right now. The government, we just came through this pandemic. The government is very concerned about making sure that people are able to feed their families, that you can keep your house. And so they're passing lots of legislation and they're printing lots of money to ensure that we can all make our way through this pandemic and then beyond and have this economic recovery. What I'm concerned about is this stimulus spending causing inflation.
And again, you kind of think about common sense. If there is a certain supply of money in circulation and the government starts printing money and adding more bills and more bills and more bills and more stimulus, you would assume that, man, the value of our currency, the value of the dollar is going to decrease. Does that mean that rampant inflation is on its way? Does that mean that rampant inflation is coming towards us?
So, here's where one of the ways I was inspired, in addition to some conversations with some construction people I had, I get my emails of other, bloggers, podcasters, and so forth. And one of the friends of our show is Fritz over at the Retirement Manifesto. And I saw he had a show. I mean, he did some notes on inflation, and he had a great quote. And here it was. It was from Morgan Housel, and it said, adjusted for inflation, the two stimulus packages passed in the last 9 months are roughly equal to what we spent fighting World War II over 2 years.
So when you think, if you kind of go back in history and think about World War II spending and what was required of the country to all come together and be able to fight the war effort, to fund the war machine, over that 2-year period, we have surpassed that in the last 9 months of stimulus, just trying to get us through this pandemic, just trying to get us through sort of this COVID thing. That should be something that gives you a little bit of pause, or at least makes you think, is this something I ought to be paying attention to?
Well, it's definitely alarming. And this is what I was kind of getting to, is that I am nervous because with as much debt as we're running as a country, I think from some policymakers, they think that this is inflation in some forms is good.
Sure.
Because if you owe, $26 trillion back, the best way to pay back $26 trillion is to make it not seem like as big of a number. Yep. So you inflate your currency so that paying it back is not that big of a deal. So I'm worried there's this concern, this thought, hey, we'll just inflate things and it will be okay. So we think this is good. And that's the type of inflation where you hear a knock on the door, you open it up and you invite them in and it all works out like this awesome plan that you have.
Sure.
I don't think that's what's coming, though. What I'm more concerned about is there's no knock at the door. This is going to be one of those things where we're hanging out and all of a sudden the door gets kicked in and this beast of a concern actually just rolls onto us. And let us show you what we're talking about. We actually have a graph of historical inflation from 1914 to 2020, and there's a period of a lot of EKG volatility. Sure. And then there's a period after in the kind of mid-'80s where inflation is dropping, and then it just kind of hangs out at the bottom.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. At the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, it was a lot of wild volatility, super high inflation, super high deflation. Then it moderated through the 50s and 60s. And then what we all think about in recent memory is the late 70s. But really, since the late 70s, we've not seen excessive inflation as we've gone through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Since 2014, all the way through the end of 2020, inflation has averaged about 3.2% per year. So even factoring in that wild EKG early on, the average has been about 3.2%. We all know that if there is an average of 3.2% and there was a lot of it early on, and then it's moderated. It's been moderated for a while. If we're going to stay true to that average, we would assume that moving forward, we'll probably have some level of inflation greater than the average. Because again, there's a natural reversion to the mean that takes place.
Well, that's what I think in show prep meeting you gave a big
Uh-oh.
because I mean if you look at the graphic, I mean if we are reverting to the mean, that means we're probably going to go well above where we are now. Now look, you said something, and I want to give you a chance to pontificate a little bit.
Okay.
You said you don't think that we're going back to like 15-20% inflation. Give your prediction. I know predictions are dangerous, but kind of give your thoughts on things.
Now, look, I could totally be wrong on this, right? But if we think about inflation by decade, right? So you can see that in the 40s, it was 5.6%. In the 50s, it was low. And then in the 70s and 80s, 7.1% average inflation. In the 80s, it was 5.6% average inflation. And since then, it sort of pared down, right?
Yep.
1990s, it was 3, and then 2.6, 1.8, 1.2. So we've been in this time when inflation has moderated, right? If we believe that reversion to the mean happens, that means that we should be able to expect some level of increased inflation in the future to get us back to that average 3.2. Well, what is different, I think, now versus what was present 30, 40, 50 years ago is there are a lot of hands in the pot right now. There are a lot of central banks. There are a lot of powers that be that want to have a hand on and control inflation. And there's even some way that currency is managed that is different than it was 40 or 50 years ago. My prediction is not that we're going to see rampant outsized inflation, because I think there are enough factors at play that can kind of control it. But I do think we probably are going to see elevated levels of inflation. And if reversion to the mean holds, it's probably going to last for a longer period of time than I think we've been historically used to.
Well, I think because I think we've put a little shock and awe on how you need to be concerned about inflation. But there is something that's under the surface that we all need to be aware of. The government has every incentive currently, all the world governments have every incentive currently to keep interest rates as low as possible. And the primary driver of that is they have a ton of debt on their balance sheets. And they know as soon as interest rates go up, they have to, guess what, pay more interest on all the debt and all the money they printed. So there is a lot of incentive to kind of keep this game going on as long as possible. So I just want to make sure you're aware of this. And because we've been hearing the drumbeat of runaway inflation since really 2008 when quantitative easing started. I mean, this is every year we have, more pontification, more analysts saying, guess what? Inflation will be here anytime now. And then we make it another 12 months, and guess what? It doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think and you can even stretch it further than 12 months. You think about 2008. If you were making decisions thinking, oh, inflation is coming, and I'm going to make whatever decision it was to try to combat that, starting in 2008, you've kind of been wrong in 2009 and 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 and so on. So while my whole estimation of what inflation could do, while it could be right, it could also be very, very wrong. We don't know. And we think when it comes to portfolio construction, one of the things you have to come to grips with is we don't always know exactly what's going to happen. So we think whenever there's uncertainty, you want to spread your risk and plan for what could come and not bet on what you think might happen for sure.